No other superhero's video game history is quite as rich as Spider-Man's games, featuring the iconic wall crawler date back decades and span multiple platforms and genres. Most of them are fantastic, although one or two did leave a sour taste in the mouths of players. Either way, though, there are definitely a lot more Spider-Man games to choose from than there are games based on other popular superhero franchises, whether web swinging his way through a lifelike rendition of New York or going toe-to-toe with some of the many iconic Spider-Man villains in a side-scrolling beat-em-up adventure. Peter Parker's alter ego usually does so with a certain level of style. It's not always Peter, though, with other versions of the hero like Miles Morales' Spider-Man 2099 and Spider-Man Noir also appearing in several of the best Spider-Man games when it comes to superheroes. Few are as better suited too. Video game adaptations as Marvel Spider-Man, when combined with his excellent combat skills, the wall-crawling webhead's ability to swing through the air, makes him the ultimate playable character, which in turn has led to some truly fantastic video games. Despite taking its name from the separation anxiety comic book series, Venom Spider-Man Separation Anxiety has a lot more in common with Venom's debut series, Lethal Protector. This multiplayer beat-em-up allows two players to team up as the two titular characters to bring down Carnage, who serves as the game's main antagonist. Like many licensed games of the era of Venom Spider-Man Separation Anxiety can be incredibly repetitive in places, and the combat is nothing to write home about either. However, for those looking for a 16-bit Spider-Man game that they can play with friends, Separation Anxiety is a solid enough option and an interesting chapter in the wall crawler's video game history. In reality, though, the best thing about this game was probably the box art. Released for the Super Famicom in the mid-90s, The Amazing Spider-Man Lethal Foes is a Japan-exclusive Spider-Man game with its own original story. Sadly, it had very little going for it in the narrative department, although it did boast a glut of popular Spider-Man villains and a solid enough combat system. The Amazing Spider-Man Lethal Foes was also one of just a handful of games that supported Epoch's barcode battler system, with players able to gain access to new in-game content by scanning special barcodes, much like Nintendo's own e-reader accessory. The tech never really took off, but it remains an interesting part of gaming history nonetheless. Most of Spidey's earlier outings ended up being ported to handheld devices at some point, so it wasn't too surprising when Gameloft released a mobile-only Spider-Man game in 2010. Understandably, perhaps Ultimate Spider-Man Total Mayhem was nowhere near as ambitious as some of the console games that preceded it, but its simplicity arguably worked in its favor. Rather than attempting to create a huge open-world adventure, the developer opted to go down the beat-em-up route. Instead, like many of the great Spider-Man beat-em-ups from the 90s, it features solid visuals, enjoyable combat, and an extensive cast of iconic villains for players to test their skills against. Much like the movie on which it was based, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 failed even to live up to the low standards set by its predecessor, with the PS4 and Xbox One versions of the game both rocking sub 50 scores on Metacritic. That's not to say that there are no redeeming qualities, however, with the game's huge open world arguably offering a slightly nicer sandbox in which Spidey enthusiasts can play. Sadly, technical issues plagued console ports of the game, with the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions in particular struggling with frame rate issues and occasional pop-in problems. Some have speculated that the game may have been rushed out to coincide with the release of the movie, which would certainly explain the overall lack of polish. Still, for those playing on PC or newer consoles, the game can still be a lot of fun in short bursts. Spider-Man 3 is far from the best Spider-Man game of the last few decades, but still gets a lot of things right. For one thing, the sprawling sandbox in which players are placed is beautifully rendered and provides a level of detail not found in earlier Spider-Man titles. The combat's decent too, and the voice acting is usually on point. Where the game falls a little short is in its story campaign, which is propped up by a weak narrative and ridiculously short. There's still a lot of fun to be had with the game, though, particularly the Wii version, which does an excellent job of integrating motion controls into the classic Spider-Man experience. Modern Spider-Man games may be all about those big open worlds, but many of the best Spider-Man games from the 90s were side-scrolling platformers with beat-em-up elements. Granted, this was largely down to the technical limitations of the era's hardware, but the games are no less enjoyable for it. In fact, there's perhaps an argument to be made that the game's linear nature made it a lot easier for players to focus on unleashing their inner Spider. The Amazing Spider-Man vs. The Kingpin isn't the best Spider-Man game to be released in the 20th century, but it's still well worth a play. The wall crawling and platforming are surprisingly good as the game's combat. It would have been nice to have had a little more of the latter, as some of the stages are a little lacking when it comes to enemies to beat up on, but this is just a minor complaint when weighed up against the games positive qualities. Those looking for a challenging game may be better served elsewhere, though. For anyone seeking a Spider-Man game with excellent controls and fantastic visuals, The Amazing Spider-Man provides a sturdy option, whether through exploring the streets of New York or beating up on some of the city's many thugs. The game makes it surprisingly easy to get lost in Peter Parker's world, as with some of the other Spider-Man games of the era. The game's narrative does let it down a little, both due to its lack of depth and at times its repetitive nature. Some of the side quests can seem incredibly similar too. But for the first few hours at least, there's more than enough to distract from this. In terms of crafting a compelling story or showing off Spider-Man's incredible abilities, Spider-Man Friend or Foe is a bit of a failure. However, for those interested in a simple beat 'em up with a massive cast of characters, they could definitely do a lot worse than this forgotten title from 2007. Notable for being the final Spider-Man game to use the designs of the Sam Raimi film's Friend or Foe is a co-op brawler that sees Spidey teaming up with both friends and foes to stop a symbiote invasion. It's designed with younger gamers in mind, but provides enough to entertain adults for a few hours, at the very least. Now that handheld gaming is entirely dominated by mobile titles, younger gamers may not remember or appreciate the joys of having a good handheld superhero game. Spider-Man Mysterio's Menace definitely counts as one of those, a simple side-scroller with great graphics, solid controls, and catchy music. This game might not seem like much by today's standards, but was an absolute blessing at the time of its release. Even more impressive is that it arrived just a few months after the GBA's launch, yet remained the best Spider-Man game on the system. The oft-forgotten follow-up to Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, Spider-Man Edge of Time, wasn't quite as solid as the original, nor did it offer as much variation in terms of gameplay. It more than made up for this. However, with its fantastic storyline, which was written by acclaimed Spider-Man comics writer Peter David, unlike its predecessor Edge of Time, concentrates only on Peter Parker's original Spider-Man and his 2099 counterpart Miguel O'Hara. The pair must coordinate their actions across time and space to save the future from destruction. While the gameplay is repetitive and features some frustrating boss fights, it's still able to offer a good time when all's said and done. Much like Spider-Man 2000, Enter Electro saw Spidey swinging his way through the streets of New York City, though, this time with Electro serving as the main antagonist. Given how little time Maxwell Dillon's villain gets to spend in the spotlight, this decision was well received by fans of the character. Building on the solid foundations of its predecessor, Enter Electro added the ability to fight and travel on the street level. It's perhaps best remembered for being re-released to remove references to the World Trade Center following the September 11th attacks. However, that's not to say that it isn't also remembered for being a fun adventure game. The appropriately named Spider-Man the video game in 1991. It was released for the Sega System 32. The premise is simple. Spider-Man and his allies are on a quest to retrieve an artifact and encounter villains like Kingpin, Venom, Green Goblin, and Doctor Doom as they seek to track it down. Though the arcade game was centered around Spider-Man, the multiplayer functionality allowed users to play as other heroes. Black Cat, Hawkeye, and Submariner were all playable, which is great because they haven't been in a ton of video games, though largely forgotten these days. The arcade classic was widely praised as being one of the best superhero games of its time when it was released. While Spider-Man 2 gets all the glory in terms of Spider-Man movie-based games, its predecessor isn't too far behind. Based on the first Sam Raimi movie, Spider-Man 2002 is the next evolution from the critically acclaimed PS1 Spider-Man titles from Neversoft, with much improved combat, crisper graphics, and an expanded moveset. It plays like a joy. One of the game's highlights is the epic Green Goblin boss fight, which remains one of the best to have featured in a Spider-Man game. Fighting him in the sky, on his glider, and on the ground is challenging but rewarding, exactly how it should be. Speaking of the Green Goblin, a cheat code in the game allows players to play through an alternate story with Harry Osborn in the suit, which provides some nice variation and helps keep things feeling fresh. Ultimate Spider-Man is loosely based on the comic book series of the same name and has become a favorite of many fans. It had the benefit of being written by the hugely talented Brian Michael Bendis, who also penned the series. In it, players control both Spider-Man and Venom, providing a vastly different experience each time. With both characters, players can free roam throughout the city, do their own thing, or take on missions to advance the story. Venom needs to feed to replenish his health, though, which means eating people. Yes, it's a game where the protagonist eats people. The story was good enough that Bendis adapted it back into the original series. Spider-Man Web of Shadows arrived in 2008 and was an instant hit for the PlayStation 3, Nintendo Wii, Xbox 360, and various other platforms. This was a game that delivered in terms of being a ton of fun and having an emotional plot. In fact, many still consider it to be their favorite Spider-Man game. The The game's dramatic story involves Venom infecting New York City with symbiotes, but even more than a fantastic Spidey vs. Venom tale, this game stands out for the awesome guest appearances, which include cameos from Moon Knight, Luke Cage, and Wolverine. Released in 2004, Spider-Man 2 was based on the blockbuster movie of the same name. One of the more interesting things about the game is that it incorporated elements of both Spider-Man and Peter Parker's lives. This means that players have to juggle everything from fighting crime to maintaining relationships. Has certainly helped that the game was home to one of the best web-swinging engines of all time. When combined with a huge map of Manhattan, players were given a ton of space to do almost anything they wished. Like the film that was based on the game was met with widespread acclaim, and it remains a firm favorite of many fans. Those who know their Spider-Man lore will probably remember the iconic comic book storyline that Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage is based on. The game came out in 1994, which was right around the time that the popular animated Spider-Man TV series was a hit. Players control both Spidey and Venom as they attempt to stop Carnage and his henchman. Maximum Carnage was one of the better side-scrolling action games of its era and was able to garner respectable reviews from both gamers and critics alike. Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions is a 2010 multi-platform release that allows gamers to control one of 4 different versions of Spider-Man. The game includes Ultimate Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man Noir, and Spider-Man 2099, which in turn provides plenty of gameplay variation. Shattered Dimensions is incredibly fun to play, mainly due to the different gameplay styles. For example, Noir is all about stealth, while 2099 has high-tech gadgets. Enjoyment really was around every corner, though the most memorable aspect may have been the multitude of awesome boss battles. For a lot of folks, this 2000 release for the PlayStation and later for other systems was the holy grail of Spider-Man games. It set the standard for how to do a 3D Spider-Man game properly. While obviously dated today, Spider-Man made web swinging into something special and featured some great combat aspects. Gamers were treated to an impressive story that moved at a wild pace and featured tons of characters and cameos. Who could forget the final fight against a terrifying combination of Carnage and Doc Ock? Although the game is still fairly recent when compared to some of the other great Spider-Man games, Spider-Man Miles Morales on the PS5 and PS4 is an incredible video game. Miles Morales' first big solo outing is full of wonderful moments and provides an overall experience that's not to be missed. Insomniac Games has trimmed the fat off the original and added new mechanics that make Miles feel different enough from Peter without entirely changing what people loved about its predecessor. Where it falls short is with its extremely short campaign, but the game is so enjoyable that it hardly even matters. Marvel's Spider-Man revolutionized the concept of web swinging and became something of an instant classic when it was released in 2018. The game does everything so smoothly that players can easily lose hours just exploring its incredible rendition of New York. The game also features a great story, but tons of nods to the character's lore and phenomenal gameplay. More than half a decade on from its initial release, Marvel's Spider-Man remains a thoroughly entertaining experience, and that seems unlikely to change anytime soon. Even with a weak puzzle gaming section, this is hands down one of the best Spider-Man games of all time, and one that fans of superhero games would be foolish not to check out at some point. It may not be as groundbreaking as its 2018 predecessor, but it would be hard to argue that Marvel's Spider-Man 2 isn't the better game. It offers improvements in just about every area and manages to look even more breathtaking thanks to the additional power of the PlayStation 5 and Insomniac's decision to focus on a single platform rather than pursue a dual generation release like Santa Monica Studios and Guerrilla Games did with God of War Ragnarok and Horizon Forbidden West respectively. Some will perhaps criticize the game's relatively short length, but for those with busy lifestyles, being able to unlock the Platinum Trophy in under 30 hours will likely be seen as a huge positive rather than a minor fault. Story-wise, it can at times feel as though Miles isn't getting his fair share of time in the spotlight, and the Mary Jane sections won't be to everybody's taste just about. Everything else is top-notch, though, making this the first true must-play PS5 exclusive and the best Spider-Man game to date.